Thanks, Joe, for that really nice introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak here. I'm really honored to be here to share some of my research with you. One thing about Pete Sampras, though, I should mention, though, he's starting to lose his hair. So I hope that doesn't mean that I'm going to start losing mine pretty soon. So what I'm going to be talking about today are sort of two topics. So I'm going to be talking a bit about self-regulation or self-control and how self-control manifests itself in the brain. And then I'm also going to be talking about how interacting with different environments, such as interacting with natural environments, such as local parks, can actually improve people's self-control behavior and also improve their memory and attention. And please, too, if during the talk, if I say something that's not clear, just raise your hand and ask away, because I don't want anybody to get kind of lost along the way. So here's an outline of the talk. So I'm going to be talking first about some of the cognitive and neural mechanisms of delaying gratification, which is another name for self-regulation or self-control. Then I'm going to be talking about how interacting with nature, interacting with natural environments, can actually improve people's self-control. And then in the third part of the talk, I'll actually talk about a theory called attention restoration theory, which is a theory that posits why interacting with nature is beneficial and why interacting with nature might improve people's self-control and their attention. And then the last part of the talk, I'll focus on some of the work that we're doing now to try to uncover the features of nature versus the features of more urban environments that may lead to these benefits, with the hope that if we can actually identify what the features of nature are that lead to these benefits, then we can sort of design future environments sort of more optimally to improve people's behavior. So first I'm going to talk about the work on delaying gratification, self-control. So how many of you are familiar with the marshmallow studies that were done in the 1960s? Yeah. So these were classic experiments that were done by Walter Mischel at Stanford University. And basically what he did is he brought 4-year-olds into the laboratory. He put a marshmallow in front of the 4-year-olds and basically gave them the simple instruction: you can eat this marshmallow now, or if you wait for 15 minutes, you'll be rewarded with 2 marshmallows. And basically what the experimenters did is that they closed the door and they watched to see which children would eat the marshmallow and which would actually delay for the 2 marshmallows. And while this may not be a very challenging task for a 25-year-old, for a 4-year-old, this is really difficult. It's really, really hard for these 4-year-olds to resist that urge, that temptation to eat the marshmallow immediately. So this is a very, very challenging task for a 4-year-old. And it turns out if you track these children over time, the 4-year-olds that were able to delay gratification to resist that initial urge to eat the marshmallow, when they're teenagers, they're less likely to abuse drugs. When they're adults, they have lower body mass index. They're also less likely to divorce, and they have more money saved in their bank account. So this one behavior at age 4 is predictive of all these other future behaviors later in life. So this ability to sort of control our impulses seems to be critical to a lot of other behaviors. One thing I want to mention, too, is that you might be thinking, well, the people that are able to delay gratification, they're smarter, maybe they come from better families, and the people that aren't able to delay gratification, they're maybe not as smart, they're lazy, that these groups just differ fundamentally. That's not the case with this sample. This sample is very homogeneous. Basically, all of these kids were sons and daughters of Stanford professors. They all came from very high socioeconomic status. When you look at their IQ, there's no IQ differences between the two groups, so their intelligence levels are the same. What they differ on is the ability to delay gratification. So they differ on this one behavior. So it's not like there's winners and losers. All of these people have achieved a lot in life, but they do differ in their ability to self-control, to self-regulate. So we asked the following question. So we took these same 4-year-olds who are now 45 years old, and we asked two different questions. So one question is, we wondered whether this ability to delay gratification would be related to some basic tasks that we study in our psychology lab, One being the ability to control interference in short-term memory. And what I mean by that is that in our daily life, we get a lot of information in memory, and sometimes that information in memory can kind of interfere with our ability to do some other task. So how many of you have had the experience where you want to dial somebody's phone number, and you actually dial a previous phone number that you've just dialed before? Does that kind of seem like a common experience? Or maybe you've had the urge you're watching television, you have the urge to get a drink from the kitchen, you go into the kitchen, and you can't remember why you're in the kitchen, okay? So the reason for that is because of interference, because we're constantly balancing information in short-term memory, and we wondered if this ability to sort of balance information in short-term memory may be related to the ability of delaying gratification. Simultaneously, while people were doing this interference task, we also had them in the MRI scanner so that we could be monitoring their brain activity patterns while they were doing this task. And we thought that maybe the people who had better self-control, maybe their brain networks are sort of more efficient when they're doing this interference task. So these two different hypotheses to look at. So again, we had 12 people in our study who were high delayers. These were people at 4 years old that resisted the temptation to eat the marshmallow immediately. 12 people who did not resist the temptation to eat the marshmallow immediately. And we scanned these participants at 45 years old. I should also mention, too, that these people had consistent self-control over their lifespan. So they were consistently high self-control from 4 to 45 or consistently low in self-control from 4 to 45. So here's the task that we use to assess the ability to manage interference in short-term memory. So this is called the directed forgetting task. And initially, participants have to remember these 6 letters. So they have to remember J, K, and P, S, C, and R. And they also need to remember the location of the items, that J, K, and P are at the top of the display, and S, C, and R are at the bottom of the display. And then we take away the stimuli. So then the participant is rehearsing these items, J, K, P, S, C, R, J, K, P, S, C, and R. And then we give them this cue that says, okay, now I want you to forget the top item, so forget J, K, and P, and only remember S, C, or R, okay? And then there's another delay period, and then we show people a single item, and they need to respond yes or no, whether that single item is one of the items that should be in memory versus one of the items that's not in memory. So in this case, you might notice that P is not S, C, or R, so the participant should respond no. But P was initially had to be remembered, and now we're telling you to forget that item. So it's actually it's harder for participants to say no to this item because it's familiar. This item, you initially had to remember it, now I'm telling you to forget it. It's familiar, it's a little bit hard for you to say no to this item. We'd say that these items have interference, so they're interfering in memory, they interfere with your performance, and it's hard for you to reject these items. We compare these items with another trial. So here I'm showing the participant the same stimuli, but this time we probe them with the letter M. M is not familiar. They haven't seen this item for some time. It's very easy for them to reject this item. So we say this is a non-interference trial. And what we do is we compare people's brain activity and also their behavioral performance, their reaction time, and their accuracy for these 2 trials to basically get an assessment of how able you are to resolve interference in short-term memory. So if there's a large difference between these 2 trials, if these are really hard compared to these trials, we'd say if you get information in memory, it becomes really sticky for you and it's hard for you to get it out. Versus somebody that doesn't show a large difference here, maybe they're really able to get rid of interfering information in short-term memory once it gets in. So the question is, might this ability be related to resisting eating the marshmallow, with the idea being if you've got this really appetitive marshmallow in front of you, that's getting into memory, and if you're able to sort of dampen down that urge, that might be related to this ability to remove information in short-term memory. So that's the basic idea. So does this task seem pretty clear? Okay. So here are the brain activity patterns that you typically get for this task. So people, for these interference trials, they tend to be 50 to 100 milliseconds slower. So they're slower to respond no to these trials. They also make more mistakes, so they make about 5% more mistakes on these interference trials compared to the non-interference trials. And here are the brain areas that tend to be most active for these interference trials versus the non-interference trials. So you get a network of areas that are more active when you're trying to remove this information from short-term memory relative to items that don't have to be removed from short-term memory. And one of the key areas here is this left frontal gyrus, although all of these areas seem to be critical to resolving interference in short-term memory. So what we did is we gave these delay of gratification participants a similar task. This time, instead of using letters, we used words, and the words were in different colored ink, so you had to remember the words and the ink color of the words. And then we gave participants a forget cue to forget some of the words in the different color ink. So in this case, forget the teal words and only remember the blue words. And again, we have trials that you initially had to remember but now had to forget. So these are the lure or interference trials. We have trials that aren't familiar, that are easy to reject. And then we also have yes trials, trials that are one of the 3 items that you're supposed to remember. And you get these same brain networks in these 45-year-olds that we typically get in our college-age sample when we do this task. So here are the behavioral results. So we thought that behaviorally we would see differences between the high and low delayers. We thought the people with sort of the superior self-control, the high delaying participants, would do better on this task compared to the low delaying participants. But it turns out, in terms of their reaction time and their accuracy, there were no differences between the 2 groups. So both groups could perform this task equally well, basically. But we did find some interesting differences when we looked at their brain networks that were involved in performing this task. So this gets a little complicated, so I'm going to kind of talk about this from a high level, but if you have more specific questions, I'm happy to answer them. So our measure of neural efficiency, our measure of how sort of efficient the brain networks were, is that we trained a computer algorithm to classify for each subject the lure trials versus the control trials. So tell us the brain areas, the combination of brain areas that distinguishes these interference trials from the non-interference trials. And as part of this classification algorithm, we determine sort of how many brain networks or how many principal components are there that are necessary to sort of optimally classify these 2 trial types. So if it takes fewer brain networks to distinguish these 2 trial types, we'd say that you have a more efficient network, that a kind of a simpler brain network model can explain performance on these 2 trials. If more components are necessary to optimize the classification, we'd say that you need a kind of a more complex model or more complex brain networks to explain the differences between these 2 trial types. And this is just kind of specifics, but what we did is for each subject, we trained this classification algorithm on 70% of the data and then tested on 30% of the data that the classifier hadn't seen. And we did this 500 times to kind of get a stable measure of efficiency. So any questions about any of this? So the details really aren't critical. It's just that we think these are good measures to sort of assess the efficiency of people's brain networks. And it turns out we see really robust differences in the efficiency of these brain networks between the 2 groups. The high delaying participants, the participants that have sort of the better self-control, it takes on average about 5 principal components to optimize the classification of these interference versus non-interference trials. But for the low delaying participants, it takes upwards of 12 or 15 principal components to optimize the classification. So it takes sort of a more complex model to distinguish these 2 different trial types for the people with the poorer self-control than the people with the better self-control.
Are you saying more of the brain areas are required?
Not necessarily more of the brain areas, but more the interaction between the brain areas is more complicated for the low delaying participants than the high delaying participants. Yeah, but it's not like this group is only recruiting a small set of brain areas and the other group is activating a larger set of brain areas. It's not quite that simple. It's the interaction of the different brain areas is more complicated for the low delaying participants than the high delaying participants. Okay. So then we also wondered, for each subject, we can also get a map of the different brain areas that contribute to this classification accuracy. So what is sort of the pattern in the brain that distinguishes these two trial types for both groups? And we can calculate how similar these brain patterns are for the high delaying group compared to the low delaying group. So we can see how similar are the brain activity patterns for the high delaying group compared to the low delaying group. And here's what those results look like. So a high value here, a high Euclidean distance, means that your map is very different from other maps in your group. And a low value means that your map is very similar to other people in your group. So you can see that this measure of similarity is much lower, which means that the maps for the high delaying participants, their brain patterns are much more similar to one another compared to the low delaying participants, the participants with poor self-control. Their maps are very heterogeneous. They're very different from one another. Okay, so the high delaying group, they all seem to be, in some sense, doing the same thing when they're doing this interference task, but the people with the poorer self-control are sort of doing many different things, at least in terms of the brain, from each other. Okay? And actually, to take this one step further, what we can do is we can take each person's brain activity map, their classification map, train another computer algorithm based on whether the map originated from a high delayer or a low delayer, and then we can take somebody's classification map that the classifier hasn't seen and predict, did this map come from a high delayer or a low delayer? Okay? And it turns out that we can do this with 71% accuracy. So we can have somebody's brain activity pattern map, and we can predict with 71% accuracy whether they were a person that ate the marshmallow 40 years ago or somebody that didn't eat the marshmallow 40 years ago. So we think that in some sense, these brain patterns that we are getting might be kind of some sort of biomarker of self-control, that you could potentially use these patterns to predict whether somebody has poorer or better self-control. Okay? So what's interesting, just to summarize here, we're finding that these people had equivalent behavioral performance for this task, but the high delayers, the people with the better self-control, are more efficient in their brain networks when doing this interference task, and that the high delayers are more homogeneous as a group. So their brain activity patterns are more similar to one another compared to the low delaying group that are more variable. And this sort of brought to mind the first line of Anna Karenina. So the first line of Anna Karenina is that all happy families are the same. All unhappy families are unhappy in their own way, right? So maybe there's sort of one brain route to self-control, but many different brain routes to lack of self-control, right? We can predict who is a high or low delayer with 71% accuracy, which I think is pretty impressive. So we can take somebody's brain activity patterns in the present and predict behaviors that happened years before. Right? We can kind of go back in time and predict behaviors from a year before. And it's possible that maybe if you have sort of more efficient brain networks when doing this task, it can help you to navigate the external environment in sort of more optimal ways. That you know, in the external environment, we're faced with all of these different impulses or different stimulation that may not be good for us. And maybe if you have a more efficient brain network, you can kind of navigate that external environment a little bit more optimally. So what I'd like to do now is switch gears a little bit and talk about some research into how we might be able to improve people's self-control by having them interact with different environments, and in particular, having them interact with nature, with natural environments. That there's been some research that's demonstrated that natural environments can potentially improve people's self-control. And some of the most interesting research in this area has come from some studies that were done in public housing in the United States. So some of the studies were from these Robert Taylor homes. So these are public housing projects in Chicago. And as you may know, public housing in the United States is not a very, they're poor environments to live in. These environments tend to have high crime rates, lots of drug abuse. The effect on children is very bad, so there's a lot of academic underachievement, juvenile delinquency, teenage pregnancy. So these environments tend not to be very good environments to live in. But as it turns out, some of these different environments, they vary a little bit in terms of the amount of nature that surrounds different apartments in these public housing projects. So this was work done by Taylor, Kuo, and Sullivan. And what they did was they studied different views from the windows of these different apartments in these Robert Taylor homes. And in this first study, they looked at 169 child guardian pairs. So they were looking at 169 different apartments in these Robert Taylor homes to assess the amount of nature that could be viewed from these different apartments. So here are some examples. So here's an example of a poor nature view from the apartment. So here you can see that these apartments are viewing just some asphalt and concrete, so just these built features, whereas this is what would be qualified as a good nature view, so a little patch of grass and some trees. So they studied children that had these sort of modest views of nature versus children that had these poorer views of nature. And what they found is that if you look at memory and attention, the kids that have the modest view of nature, they scored better on measures of concentration and memory than the kids that had the poorer nature views. And they also had better self-control. So the kids that had the modest nature view, they were better on some impulse inhibition tasks, such as the Stroop task, and they had better delay of gratification. So they were better able to control their impulses if they had these modest views of nature compared to poor views of nature from their apartment. Now one thing that you might be thinking is, okay, but maybe people that are wealthier get the modest views of nature, and the people that are poor get the worst views of nature. Well, that's not the case at all. These people are randomly assigned to the different apartments. In addition, you might be thinking, well, maybe if people had sort of this modest view of nature, maybe they're looking out the window more often, and the people that don't have the modest view of nature, they aren't looking out the window. Well, it turns out these people don't even notice whether they have nature out of their window or not. It's a very implicit effect. So the environment is having this impact on behavior even if people aren't really consciously aware of what's outside their view from their window. They've also done some studies with adults. So these were studies done from another public housing project in Chicago, this time the Ida Wells Public Housing Facility. So here's an example of a poor nature view. Here's an example of sort of a better nature view. And if you look at the number of reported crimes from these different apartments, they actually decrease linearly with the amount of surrounding vegetation from the apartment. So if there's more green space, more vegetation outside of your apartment here, there's less reported crime than if there is less vegetation out of your apartment. Okay? Yes?
Just to clarify, when you said that the people in the apartment were randomly selected, this was back at your last
Mm-hmm.
I presume that between poor or well off, but I presume because it's a housing project that everyone is poor there. Is that the wrong assumption?
No, everyone would probably be a low SES status, but it's not the case that people are slightly above have the better views of nature. Just everybody is randomly assigned to the different apartments.
Okay.
Yep.
Is there any study to show that whether artificially created nature, murals on the wall of trees, something on that line, would work as well?
So there have been studies of workplaces. So they go to workplaces, they put up an LCD screen, so a TV screen that's flipping through nature pictures, and they find that that's better than nothing, but not as good as an actual window to nature. Yeah. Yeah.
Does any of this data that a home and it's more stable over a longer time?
It could be. So that's not controlled for here. But my hunch is that that would just kind of be a noise variable, that the people with the nature views weren't living there in that apartment longer than the people without the nature view. But that's certainly an interesting question. And I actually, towards the end of the talk, I can present some studies that we're thinking about doing now to actually look at that, the duration of your nature exposure and how that might affect the effects. So again, the amount of reported crimes decreased linearly with the amount of vegetation. In another study, back to the Robert Taylor homes, they looked at the amount of reported aggression in these apartments by the amount of nature around the apartments, and they found that with more nature, there was less overall reported aggression. And these adults also had better attention, better concentration abilities when they had more nature surrounding their apartments. And importantly, these attentional benefits mediated the aggression benefits. And what I mean by that is that it may be that people's improvements in aggression are driven by their improvements in attention. So that when you're better able to concentrate, when you have better attention levels, you're also better able to control your behavior. You have better self-control if you have better attention. And this is an important part when I start talking about the theory as to why we believe that interacting with nature is beneficial. And the reason that we think interacting with nature is beneficial is because we think that interacting with nature improves attention, and by improving attention, you can improve people's self-control. So just to summarize, presented a very modest intervention. So these modest views of nature had a positive impact on self-regulation and also cognitive performance. And that attention plays a really critical role, that we think these benefits in self-control and self-regulation are due to improving people's attention. I also want to make one thing clear, too. I'm not suggesting that planting trees is going to solve all these problems. Okay, so that's not what I'm suggesting. These are obviously very complicated problems. But what I am suggesting is that modest modifications to the environment might have big changes in people's behavior. So maybe by making some tweaks to the physical environment, we may be able to change people's behavior to improve their intention and improve their self-control. Okay? So now why? Why do we think that interacting with nature is beneficial? What is it about nature that leads to these benefits? There are a number of theories that posit why interacting with nature is beneficial. So one theory is called attention restoration theory. That's the theory that I support, and that's what I'm going to talk to in more depth. But there are many other theories as to why interacting with nature is beneficial. So one theory is the biophilia hypothesis, which the basic premise is that we sort of have this innate love for nature, and therefore if we interact with nature, we're sort of satisfying this innate drive or innate love. People also claim that we sort of have a natural connectedness to nature, and that when we interact with nature, we become more connected to nature and more connected to things in the natural world, and that can be beneficial. And other people believe that actually interacting with nature reduces stress levels, and that's why interacting with nature leads to these benefits. There's a number of different theories as to why interacting with nature is beneficial, but I'm going to focus the most on attention restoration theory. So one of the key elements to attention restoration theory is the division of attention into two forms or two kinds. So one kind of attention is called voluntary or directed attention. Psychologists sometimes call this top-down or endogenous attention. And this is the kind of attention where you as an individual person are directing your attentional focus. So right now, as you're listening to me talk, you're using directed attention. You're choosing to listen to me, even though there may be more interesting things out in the environment to attend to. But you're choosing to direct your attention towards me. And it's thought that this kind of attention is finite or can be depleted, that you can only direct your attention for so long before you become mentally fatigued and you can't pay attention anymore. And from looking around the audience, I'd say you have more attention at the beginning of my talk than you have towards the end of my talk, and that's because we're limited in this ability to pay attention. It's just hard to direct your attention for a long period of time. And that's why after a long day of work, you're mentally fatigued and it's really hard to concentrate. So when you feel mentally fatigued, that's when your directed attention is being depleted. And that's a good time to take a break. Okay? That's contrary to involuntary attention or bottom-up or exogenous attention, and that's the kind of attention that's automatically captured by interesting stimulation in the environment. So loud noises, bright lights, that kind of stimulation automatically captures your attention. You don't really have much control over it. And it's thought that that kind of attention is less susceptible to depletion or fatigue. So you don't often hear people say, wow, I'm really exhausted looking at that beautiful waterfall. It's just too tiring looking at it. Or looking at that beautiful painting is just exhausting looking at that. So this kind of involuntary attention that's stimulus-driven, driven by fascinating stimulation in the environment, tends not to be fatigable or depletable, or less susceptible to fatigue or depletion. So the idea behind attention restoration theory is that find environments that have lots of interesting stimulation to capture the involuntary attention, while at the same time not taxing the directed attention. So not requiring you to be very vigilant or having to concentrate very hard. And it just so happens that natural environments tend to meet this criteria, that natural environments tend to have interesting stimulation that automatically captures your attention while simultaneously not requiring you to use a lot of vigilance or directed attention. So when you're in a local park, you typically don't have to worry about getting hit by a car. You don't have to worry about bumping into anybody. There's no kind of distracting advertising in a natural environment. So in a natural environment, you can tend to just kind of mind wander and focus on the interesting stimulation in the environment. So according to attention restoration theory, natural environments are not the only environment that might be restorative. It's just one good example of an environment that may be restorative. So it's possible that you could walk through a museum and get the same benefits. In a lot of museums, they're kind of quiet. You don't have to use a lot of vigilance, and there's a lot of interesting stimulation to capture your attention. But it just so happens that natural environments meet this criteria very strongly. This is not to say that there's not something special about natural environments. So there may be something special above and beyond attention restoration theory as to why nature is beneficial. But at least for the purposes of just talking about attention restoration theory, nature is just one good example of an environment that would be restorative. So another concept that's important to mention too is the concept of soft fascination. So it's theorized that the type of stimulation to capture your involuntary attention should be soft in nature. And what I mean by that is that the stimulation should capture your involuntary attention but not be all-consuming. And what I mean by that is if you're looking at a waterfall, the waterfall is going to automatically capture your attention, but you can kind of think about other things while you're attending to the waterfall. It's not all-consuming in its attentional capture. That's different from, say, watching some kind of action movie that's also very interesting to watch, but it's sort of more all-consuming in its attentional capture. It kind of harshly captures all of your attention. You can't really attend to other things while you're watching this action movie. So it's thought that having the stimulation be softly fascinating is also critical to the environment being restorative. And it just so happens that natural environments tend to have softly fascinating stimuli, which we think is another reason why interacting with nature is beneficial. Yes?
I'm just puzzling through why you're using the word restoration as opposed to retention. To me, it suggests that it's lost and regained as opposed to a means of holding on and never losing the attention. Am I splitting hairs?
No, you're not. So the question is, right, are we replenishing you to your sort of baseline highest point of being sort of having all of your directed attention, or actually are we improving your directed attention? And I don't think we know the answer to that. So what I'll show you in a moment are some data where we actually test this theory, and you'll see that people's performance goes above their baseline performance. But the problem is they may have come into the laboratory sort of fatigued. So we don't know, are we actually improving people beyond their baseline, or are we just taking people to their baseline? I think it's kind of unknown at this point. Yeah. So how did we test attention restoration theory? Well, one of the ways we did it is with the following experiment. So we had 38 undergrads in our lab. They performed this backwards digit span task, which is a task where we present digits to the person, like 4, 6, 7, and the participant needs to repeat them back in backwards order, so 7, 6, 4. And then we keep increasing the number of digits until there's 9 digits. And as you might imagine, that's a very difficult task to do as the number of digits increases. And that requires a lot of memory, a lot of focus, a lot of directed attention. We also assess people's mood changes after the interaction with nature. These were actually walks in nature versus walks in more urban environments. We also fatigued participants with a challenging working memory task before they went on the walk, with the idea being that people would sort of show more benefit if they're in a little bit of a fatigue state, a little bit of a directed attention fatigue state. And this was a within subject design. So what that means is that participants interacted with both environments. So in 1 week, we assessed changes in mood and memory after walking in nature. Then you came back to the lab the second week and you walked in the urban environment, or vice versa. So people participated in both walks. Okay? So here's a satellite image of the 2 walks that we had people go on. So the walk in green is the walk through the Ann Arbor Arboretum. So this was our nature walk. The walk in red was the walk through downtown Ann Arbor on traffic-heavy Huron Street. So the walks were equal in distance. They were both 2.8 miles. And it took participants about 50 minutes to complete the walk. So again, participants came into the laboratory. We assessed their memory and mood. We gave them a map. We also gave them a GPS watch so that we could track them, so they didn't just go to Starbucks, that they actually went on the walk, right? They come back to the lab. We assess their mood and memory again. Then they come back to the lab a week later. We assess their mood and memory again. They walk in the other location, the different location from the first walk, and then we assess their mood and memory again. Okay? And then so half of the people walked in nature first, half of the people walked in the urban environment first.
I assume the assessment questions were a bit different?
No, we asked the same things after both walks. Yep. Okay. One other thing that's important too. We locked people's cell phone in the laboratory before they went on the walk also, right? Because we didn't want people chit-chatting on the walk. We actually wanted them to engage with the environment, right? So they kept, the cell phone was locked in the lab so they would actually engage in the environment. Because we thought if you're talking, you're going to be using directed attention and you may not get the benefit from the walk. So here are the results from the backwards digit span task. This was our main measure of memory and attention performance. And we find that before the walks, people's performance is the same. But then after they walk in a natural environment, they show about a 20% improvement in their backwards digit span performance, and they don't really show any significant improvement after the urban walk. So they show a significant improvement after walking in nature, but no real significant improvement after walking in the urban environment. And to go back to the gentleman's question here, I don't know if this is their true baseline performance or not, or if this is their true baseline, because who knows what they were doing before they came into the laboratory. So we have to kind of do further work to see if we're actually increasing people's ability beyond their baseline or not. And we'd probably want to do studies where we actually expose them to nature at multiple points, right, to see if there's some kind of cumulative effect going on. So one thing, too, that's important, we found no order effect. So it didn't matter if you walked in nature the first week or the second week. You showed improvements either way. We also found no relationship to mood. So mood tends to improve when people walk in nature. But their improvement in mood didn't correlate with their improvements in short-term memory and working memory. So what this means is that the improvements that we're getting in memory and attention are not simply due to putting people into better moods. There seems to be something more going on. And an even stronger demonstration of that is that we had people walk at different times of the year. So we had people walk in June. It was really nice in Michigan. People enjoyed the walk, and they showed the memory benefit. We also had them walk in January. They hated the walk. They said, "Mark, why did you make me go out there? It was freezing cold. I didn't like the walk." But those people in January showed the same memory improvement as the people that walked in June. So you don't even necessarily have to enjoy the walk to get the benefit. We also replicated the study, this time using pictures of nature versus pictures of urban environments to get even more experimental control. And we found that simply even when people just view pictures of nature versus pictures of urban scenes, we find similar changes in backwards digit span performance. And we also found changes that were selective to sort of directed attention components. So there's this attention network task that sort of tests different kinds of attention, tests sort of more the involuntary attention versus directed attention, and we only found improvements in the directed attention parts of this task, not attention generally. So the effects seem to be specific to this ability to direct attention. So just to summarize, we find that brief interactions with nature, so just a 50-minute walk or viewing pictures of nature for 10 minutes can lead to about a 20% improvement in working memory span. The effects are not driven by mood or time of year. We found similar effects with pictures, and the effects seem to be specific to improving directed attention, this resource that we think is important to self-control and other kind of cognitive functions. So in this last portion of the talk, I'd like to talk sort of more specifically about what we think it is about nature that may be leading to these benefits, with the idea being if we can understand sort of the physical features of nature that may lead to these benefits, then we can sort of go to designers, go to landscape architects and say, hey, we think that these sort of design elements are critical to improving people's performance, and maybe you want to consider implementing these elements into new design of built environments. But this is actually not a very easy thing to do, because if you were to think about all the different things that differ between natural environments and urban environments, it's almost infinite. There's so many different things that differ between the two environments. So how are we going to take all these different things that differ between these environments and sort of pare them down into a few critical things to then test to see if it impacts people's psychological performance? So what I'm going to show you in a moment is how we've begun to start to sort of pare down the number of things that differ between these different environments to see if they may affect people's behavior. So one of the ways that we did that first was actually to just show people pictures of different natural and urban environments and have them sort of rate the similarity of these different environments. And then we ran a statistical program called multidimensional scaling, which is a way to, you take this similarity matrix of all these different ratings of the similarity of these different natural and urban settings, and what multidimensional scaling does is it gives you dimensions that explain the most variance in the data. So to give you sort of a more concrete example, I could show you a matrix of the distance between different cities in the United States. So the distance between Los Angeles and New York, the distance between New York and Washington, D.C., the difference between Boston and Los Angeles. So we could have 10 U.S. cities, and I could give you the distance between all these different cities. And if there are 10 cities, that would mean I have like 100 distances between the different cities. But that matrix of these distances really doesn't tell you anything about the holistic relationship of all these different cities. But if I run the multidimensional scaling algorithm on this distance matrix, you'll get two dimensions. The first dimension will be east-west, and the second dimension will be north-south. So then you can summarize this matrix of 100 numbers basically down to 20 numbers. A location, a coordinate, east-west, and north-south, and then you plot that and you get a whole map of the United States, basically. This is sort of what we're doing here. We've got these distances between all these different parks, the similarity ratings, and then we're asking this algorithm, show us what these dimensions are. So I think this will be a little bit more concrete in a moment. So what we had people do is we showed them 15 natural and kind of urban scenes on the computer screen, and they move these pictures around on the screen, lumping together the similar pictures together. So these are rated more similar to one another, and the more distance means that the pictures are more dissimilar from one another. Okay? And then what we do is we run multidimensional scaling, and we get these dimensions that explain the most variance in the data. So what's plotted here are the weights for each park on their weight of dimension 1 and dimension 2, and we've actually overlaid the picture of that park here. So this is dimension 1, and this is dimension 2. So multidimensional scaling gives you the dimension, but it doesn't give you a label for the dimension. So if I were to ask you guys, what do you think is changing from left to right here? What would you say is changing? Or how would you label this dimension? Say that again? So direction, okay. Say that again? Did you say color? So there's kind of more green over here and less green over here. Anything else? Built environment, so maybe more built stuff over here, less built stuff over here. So this is exactly what we did. So then we printed posters of this result, and we brought 50 participants into the lab, and we had them label, what do you think is changing from left to right, and what do you think is changing from up to down? And the common themes that we were getting from changing from left to right were nature, natural, organic, and built. So as you're moving from left to right here, you're kind of going from more natural to less natural. So then what we did is we said, okay, we had 70 of these pictures. Let's have people rate these pictures for how natural they think they are. So we had another set of people. We showed them a single image, and they basically had to rate on a scale of 1 to 7 how natural they thought the image was. So we think this dimension 1 from this multidimensional scaling analysis, we call this kind of latent naturalness. Maybe it's related to something natural, but we don't really know that yet. So then we got measures of direct naturalness, have people rate the images directly for how natural they are, and let's see how they correspond with each other. And it turns out the correspondence is really strong. So people's direct rating of naturalness, so if you ask them how natural the image is, correlates almost perfectly with the weights from dimension 1 from this multidimensional scaling analysis. So that means if you're over on the left here, that means you've got a very negative value. So your direct naturalness is only like a 1 or a 2. But if it's I don't know, it's a 6 or a 7, right? If it's a negative value, you rate it as very natural. If you rate things as not being very natural, they've got a positive value here. So that means they're over to the right. So we get this really strong correspondence between kind of direct measures of naturalness and these kind of indirect measures of naturalness. Because when people were moving these images around on the screen, they weren't necessarily saying this is more natural and this is less natural. They were just rating the similarity of different images. And it turns out that dimension, we can actually interpret it. That dimension means it's coding for how natural people think that the image is. So why is that important? Well, that's important because it means that we can kind of, we know there's something about nature scenes that differs from urban scenes that may be beneficial to people. Now we actually have confidence that what people rate as being natural, we can really believe. So now let's try to figure out what are the features of natural environments that lead to these higher or lower naturalness ratings. So what my grad student has been doing now is he's taking scenes from nature and urban areas and he's breaking them down into their component parts. So here's a picture of a natural image. He's breaking it down to each pixel, to the brightness level of each pixel, the color saturation of each pixel, the hue of each pixel, okay? He's taking natural images and breaking down the number of little contrast changes or edges in the images, the number of straight lines in the images. Okay, so we've got these kind of low-level features. And then we can begin to correlate these low-level features with people's perception of naturalness. So it turns out that if images have more of these little contrast changes, people rate those images as being more natural. Images that have more straight lines are rated as being less natural. And it turns out if you look at the ratio between straight lines and these contrast changes, so if images have lots of straight lines and few of these contrast changes, they're not rated as being very natural. But if they have lots of these contrast changes and few straight lines, these images are rated as being very natural. So now we've actually have something that's these low-level features that may be related to naturalness. Now we can start asking the following question. Okay, the number of contrast changes predicts how natural somebody thinks an image is. Maybe that's also going to improve their working memory and attention performance. Maybe if we expose people to images that have lots of contrast changes, they're going to show more improvements in directed attention. Counter to that, maybe if we show people images that have lots of straight lines, they're not going to show improvements in directed attention. So by finding these features that code for naturalness, we can start asking these questions and sort of getting at the features that differ between natural and urban environments to see if those features matter in terms of how restorative the environment will be. Okay, so that's sort of the ultimate goal. So I talked about this. So just to conclude, we find that the ability to delay gratification is related to more efficient brain networks. Sustained exposure to modest nature can improve people's self-control, delayed gratification performance. Brief interactions with nature can produce significant benefits in memory and attention, and our future work is focused on the elements of nature that differ from urban environments with the goal of being, if we can identify these features and see how they may be related to people's psychological performance, then we can go to designers, landscape architects and say, okay, you need to incorporate more contrast changes in these new environments to say, improve people's directed attention performance. So I want to acknowledge all of my collaborators on this work. So I've worked with a great team of people on all of this, and thank you for your attention.